Okay, we'll probably still have some folks pop on, but we'll get started. Hello and welcome to the third and final session of our 2021 Rocky Mountain CESU seminar series. My name is Lisa Gerloff and I'm the Executive Coordinator for the Rocky Mountains Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit. If you are unfamiliar with CESUs, the Rocky Mountains, one of 17 CESUs that blanket the nation, is mostly an agency university network that promotes and facilitates research, technical assistance, and education projects geared to assist federal resource managers. The University of Montana is the host to this network, and I would like to acknowledge that here at UM, we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We honor the path they have always shown us in caring for this place for the generations to come. Our theme for this seminar series has been looking at the issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI. I'm a big fan of the social work researcher and podcast phenomenon, Brene Brown. Brene has two sayings that resonate for me for today's seminar. Our job is to get it right, not be right. And you don't know what you don't know, but once you know, you have the opportunity to make a different choice. Here is an opportunity for us to put our feet in the shoes of others by listening to their stories. I am honored and thankful today to have 4 Bipoc, Black, Indigenous, and people of color students join us to voice how they have and are grappling with JEDI issues in their academic journey, whether that is in the classroom or the lab, in their research in the field, or across the campus community as a whole. Before I introduce our 4 panel members, I want to quickly go over the flow of today's seminar. Each panelist will take 8 or 9 minutes to share their experiences with us. We will hold questions until all 4 have spoken. When we get to the question, answer, and discussion portion of today, I will ask you to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Today's seminar is being recorded and we will share that link with you. We'll send it out to you in an email. Let's get started. I will introduce our 4 students in the order that they will be speaking. Anaya Pascal is a junior studying organismal biology in the pre-med track at Montana State University. She is the current president of Montana State's Black Student Union and spends a lot of time advocating for BIPOC students on campus in various ways. Her most recent achievement is her role in the creation of MSU's BIPOC Action Plan. Selena Gray was born in Montana and raised in the state of Washington. She completed her bachelor's degree in wildlife and fisheries biology at Salish Kootenai College on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, and is currently working on her master's here at the University of Montana using mixed method research of cultural keystone species. Selena is active in the DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation. Daniel Byrd was born in Santa Fe and raised in the Giwa Pueblo in central New Mexico. He grew up farming, ranching, hunting, and living the Pueblo lifestyle like many of his community members. Daniel is motivated by his family, community, and friends. He hopes to increase tribal representation in the STEM fields. Daniel is working on his PhD in wildlife biology here at UM. Alicia Shaw is a postdoctoral researcher here at UM. Broadly, she studies the impact of climate change on ectotherms, especially on aquatic insects in the US as well as South America. Most recently, she, along with several colleagues, has been involved in the research of the glacial meltwater stonefly in Glacial National Park. She is also heavily involved in DEI efforts here on UM campus, including the Montana American Indian Math and Science Program. Please help me in welcoming our 4 panel members, and we will start off with Anaya.
Hello, everyone. I figured that when I was drafting ideas for how I was going to present this, I thought that the best idea was to just talk about my experiences, since I often hear the sentiment that these things don't happen in Montana or these things don't happen in the US and that it's 2020 and that these things don't happen at all. So I'm just going to go through talking about my experiences being a BIPOC and specifically a Black college student. So when I first came to MSU, I honestly expected more. I expected more than what I saw in high school. I moved from Vegas to Montana, and it was a big change, honestly, a huge culture shock. And so I didn't have the greatest experience at Bozeman High. And so I was just like, if I go to MSU, there's more people, it should be more diverse, I should feel more comfortable. But instead of being easier, actually being in college as a BIPOC student was way harder than being in high school as a BIPOC student. So I came here, I lived in the dorms like all freshmen are required to do, and I was the only BIPOC person on my entire floor in my dorm. I was one of 3 BIPOC people living in the entire freshman dorm that I knew of. And other than that, I was the only BIPOC person in many of my classes. At first, I had made up my mind that these things were things that were small. I shouldn't let this affect my college experience. I'm here to learn first and foremost. But they grew over time and they became even more distracting because it wasn't just me feeling lonely because I was the only BIPOC person, but there were also things like small microaggressions that would happen every day that would try to brush off, but it just got harder. And then there was also other things like finding hair care products, like finding shampoo for Black hair in Bozeman has been hard. And I still to this day can barely find products maybe once a month or so at Walmart. Finding makeup in my shade when I first moved here was also very hard. And there were even like hair salons that turned me down because of my hair texture. So dealing with that on top of the small microaggressions and just feeling lonely and the culture shock of having moved to Montana from Vegas grew into a huge lurking distraction that I had to deal with on top of all of my work. Like I should have been coming up with hypotheses for my lab, but I'm worrying about how awkward it's going to be walking into the lab after the questionable things I heard in the lab the last time. And I mean, there's always the explanations for the slight microaggressions afterwards, like the, hey, I'm sorry's. I didn't mean it that ways. But these things still affect me. Like, sure, in the moment I could have said, I'm fine, it's okay, and brush it off. But when that happens, like in every lab that you ever take, it gets to be a lot. And then there's things like in the field research experiences. I know a lot of my peers don't have to think about this a lot, but as a BIPOC person, well, specifically as a Black person, I'm not sure if other BIPOC groups do this, but anytime I'm looking to go anywhere, whether that's take a trip or move, or even to just go visit for like a week, visit my family, there's a Google search I have to make, and I have to literally Google, is blank place racist? And sometimes, well, actually not even sometimes, every single time you look that up, there's going to be some news article, some kind of article that will tell you like, yes, racism exists everywhere. This place is racist. But there's like, you weigh the pros and cons, because sometimes there's places where like you might just get called a racial slur. And there's other times where like this whole town banded together and burned down a BIPOC person's house. So looking into these things and having to face these things when you're just trying to learn and you just want to do research like everybody else is kind of crazy and also daunting. And looking into research things that I can do in rural Montana it can be scary for BIPOC people, because we have to think about these things. Like I've heard stories that I should never step foot into Whitefish because Whitefish is racist. And I still haven't gone because I know that I've heard these stories, and Whitefish could have changed by now, but I'm too scared to venture out and go there just because of the stuff I've heard happening there in the past. And sorry, I have speaker notes and I lost them. Okay, yeah, but being a BIPOC person in these rural spaces where racism exists can sometimes be literally a death sentence. And all of the issues I just brought up are just the subtle, like, day-to-day things that happen to me, like, once a day. Like, I'm like, oh, there's this position open. Oh, but it's in the middle of nowhere. Is that really safe? I honestly felt very lonely my first year in Montana because of the things I just talked about. And it was hard for me to feel motivated on a college campus. And that's on top of the things that any normal white student would feel, like being lonely, you're isolated from your family. College is different. College is weird. And I felt like there weren't resources on my campus that would help to combat that. There was like the DISC, the Diversity and Inclusion Student Commons, but there were necessarily, well, at the beginning, they were more geared towards LGBTQ plus issues and not necessarily like issues of race. So I felt that I had no one to talk to about these things. And then there are the marginalized group clubs. Like I ended up joining the BSU, and joining those kind of just makes you feel worse because you realize that you aren't the only person feeling this way, but then you also feel helpless because you have no way to help fix them. So when I took over as BSU's president, for context, the president that had stepped down before me stepped down because she was receiving death threats for the work that she was trying to do with BSU. And I took over this presidency knowing that I would likely get the same death threats. And sadly, I have. But these spaces, these marginalized group clubs and other groups like that, are kind of the only space that BIPOC people have to go on campus, since the rest of campus is, one, predominantly white, and two, seems to brush off these issues and do performative things. So yeah, I reported these things, I reported the racism I faced, and it seems like the reporting channels on campus aren't necessarily the best. Like, you might get a follow-up email that says, we're sorry that you feel this way, but there's nothing we can do until something happens, which is an unfortunate outlook to have, I think. So yeah, being targeted for my advocacy with BSU, I feel, I'm not sure if it's worth it, at the risk of my life, but I feel that no one else is going to do it. And there needs to be a space for Black people and a space for BIPOC people on campus. So that's why I get involved in the things that I want to get involved in. And that's why I create the action plan, which hopes to create an Africana Studies major and have spaces for BIPOC people to gather when they feel ostracized like I did in my freshman year. So that was all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Anaya. I'll be going next, and I really want to highlight the way that Anaya was feeling, and her courage in sharing, because that's really important. Not only because, she is part of a minority group here in Montana, but just like, I want everybody in this panel to be mindful of the consuming that you're doing right now of our stories, and how you go back to your everyday lives and use them, because ultimately, it is a kind of consumerism, and just being mindful and being specific in how you go back to your place of work, your place of school, your everyday life, and how you utilize this experience can be part of how you impact our communities for the better. I'll introduce myself in my Blackfeet language. I'm Blackfeet and Métis. Oki miraniko nato yipoka, nisto amskapi pikaniaki. And I just want to acknowledge again that I am on the traditional lands of the Salish and Colispe and Ponderosa people here at the University of Montana. I, like Anaya, probably started my educational experience in high school. Really, that's everybody's growing up and wondering what they're going to do next and kind of figuring that out. For a lot of minority students, and not just minority, maybe first-time college students experience the lack of resources that high schools can have for us. And people with more privilege than us don't realize that filling out a FAFSA all by yourself is like the first step to showing how much privilege you don't have. And nobody ever taught me how to do taxes or anything like that. And having to think about, well, my parents aren't going to pay for this, but I still have to, my mom makes some kind of income cap that shows that I can't be eligible for like work study. Living on that kind of cusp was my reality growing up after high school. I grew up with my mother off the reservation. My father lived on the reservation. And so I was kind of alienated from the culture. And I had moved when I was younger to Washington State. And so I grew up away from my culture in that respect as well. Luckily, Indian country is kind of small and really connected. So the tribe that I lived close by was, I had family in that tribe, and I grew up knowing coastal Pacific Northwest culture and canoe culture more than I have my Blackfeet culture. And so returning to education after high school was a goal of mine, and I wanted that connection better. So I applied to the University of Montana first. It was kind of my only choice. I wanted to go into wildlife biology. I knew that much. And one other thing that is really common with people of color is, just the life experiences of like regular life expectancies. My freshman year, my father died. And so being in a big university that was, in itself culture shock when you're 18 years old, and just kind of, learning how to navigate the big world. It was very isolating having to go through that experience by myself, removed from the Native American community that had supported me throughout my childhood. And so I took a break from school after that freshman year, and I wanted to make it productive. And so I sought out volunteer opportunities with the tribe again in Washington that I had become connected to. And that was my first kind of experience as a wildlife technician. I had that position for 6 months, and it really solidified my choice in, all the different kind of science that I was exposed to: aerial flights, fish tagging, live trapping of river otters, bird netting. I did a whole gamut of things that a lot of students just aren't exposed to, especially minority students that don't have the privilege of, being able to travel or anything like that. And so when I ultimately decided to come back to school, I had I was pregnant with twins, and not I was pretty much homeless, living in my boyfriend's house. Kind of, we were moving around. And so the transition of getting back into an undergrad as a non-traditional student was completely different than my experience coming straight out of high school. I had moved back to Montana and decided that the tribal college was the best place for me. The need for community was essential, and I wanted the connection to culture, even though, it wasn't, SKC isn't a Blackfeet school, but they're, close enough to the family that I have here in Montana that are Blackfeet. And so I felt that it was a stepping stone. And that transition was hard. I was commuting from Missoula an hour north for classes 3 times a week. I was working nights at a hotel. I was nursing twins. It was a lot going on. But the opportunities at that tribal college really set my path moving forward. And not only because of the research opportunities that I had, allowed me to stay in Montana. They recognized that I had a family. They offered me stipends instead of the classic volunteerism that we see in the natural resource field. A lot of them were on campus, and so I didn't have to worry about transitioning and paying for housing or anything like that. And so it opened also doors for travel experiences, because I was supported by a community of mentors that knew what I was going through and understood my needs. And that's really important to have. And it also provided me with a robust resume so that I could be competitive for scholarships like the UDAL that I received in 2017 paid for a whole year of school. And had I been at the university, that expense probably wouldn't have been covered. Even though it's such a big scholarship, the cost difference between a university and a tribal college is very significant. And we were still experiencing, even as a family unit, death in the community, and having to deal with that, being removed from the community and having to figure out ways to travel back home so that we could attend those protocols that we do as Native people. And it can be a challenge while you're also trying to focus on preparing for graduate school and where that road takes you. I really am passionate about Indian law and policy and how that affects the way that we manage our natural resources. And so it was a toss-up for me between going to law school and continuing on in a thesis-based master's program. The decision was made for me because I wanted to stay in the Pacific Northwest. We frequently travel home to see my partner's mother and support her, and make sure the kids know their culture and our family. And even though there have been experiences for me traveling, you have to take the time to kind of heal yourself. And so there have been summers where I don't do any research. I just focus on my cultural protocols and I travel and do that. And that's how I stay grounded. And even the transition for graduate school for me, again, I entered graduate school pregnant. And so I have a 16-month-old now. And it's been a roller coaster because graduate school is very different than an undergrad, right? It's more demanding of your creative, critical thinking in just the way that you do your homework, the culture shock of, again, having to move out of the reservation. And, even though I'm just an hour away, my husband can't go and play, football or basketball very easily. And so those times that he needs a break because I am, you know, I'm our money maker. They're few and far between, and it's definitely something that I couldn't do without his support and the support of the mentors that have been there with me throughout my undergrad and that are here now for me in my graduate school too. And a lot of those mentors are even, you know, some of my peers. I rely on my peers to get me through homework sometimes. Just yesterday, I spent the day helping out one of our cohort members in wildlife, you know, working on her proposal, because there are needs that we have as minority students that our teachers just aren't aware of and maybe don't have the intuition to sit us down and like really walk us through it. And so we navigate those journeys together, but by ourselves. And we learn from it together and it makes us stronger. But having a cohort like that, even a small one in my graduate program, has really made a difference. And so just to wrap it up, I would really encourage each of you to think about how, you know, you can make a difference and create community, and how, you know, you reach out often and just be there in ways that you would for family, because that's kind of what minority students thrive in. Having community is really important, not knowing that you're alone and having the resources. Those are just some of the things that can make or break a student, you know, who's having a rough semester. And who knows, you know, it might just be a rough semester and it might be a rough year. But knowing how to support us by making the effort to come to these kinds of things and hear our stories and listen to the kinds of challenges might give you enough know-how to reach out a little bit more often and check on us. So I'll turn it over to Daniel now, and thank you for coming and hearing our words.
Thank you, Selena. I appreciate it. I'm gonna try to share my screen really quick. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, Daniel, we can see it.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I'm Daniel Byrd, and I'm from Santo Domingo, or Kiwa in our own Keres language, Kiwa Pueblo, in central New Mexico. And I received my Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Science at New Mexico State University, and did my master's in wildlife as well at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. I'd just like to share some of my goals, and some of my goals are to assist tribes in managing wildlife and natural resources and involve the youth. And a lot of this comes from, you know, where I grew up. You can see a picture here of my village back in New Mexico during one of our feast days. And then also a sign about the ecological and cultural restoration of an area within our reservation. But growing up on the reservation, I learned early on a lot about my culture, tradition, and language through my mom and her father, so my grandfather, who I grew up with in a single parent household. But I also learned through my cousins and my uncles about all of those same you know, same things, culture, tradition, and language, which really shaped my worldview and what really pushed me into the field that I'm in today. But let's see, going into the topic for today and why I'm here is because of just the underrepresentation of folks like us in in the science and engineering occupations, as you can see here on the right, is a diagram or a graph by the National Science Foundation that shows the racial and ethnic distribution of workers in science and engineering occupations. And as you can see that Native Hawaiians, American Indians, Alaska Natives are at the very bottom. And white are about 80% of the representation within these fields and professions. And so where my perspective comes in is in the wildlife profession, and we are still very underrepresented at the tribal, state, and federal levels, which falls upon higher education and the underrepresentation within colleges like or like Purdue or like New Mexico State, non-tribal colleges. And we represent less than 1% of the student body and often have the lowest graduation rates. And so what some of the personal challenges have been for me is xenophobia, which is new territory. It's often a new place away from my home community. And it's just sort of gave me anxiety, I guess, in my early years as an undergrad, and not knowing, like Selena was saying, how to do your FAFSA, how to apply for scholarships, how to apply to colleges. Like, I didn't have mentors who taught me that as a youth growing up or while I was in high school. And so really, New Mexico State was sort of the only choice for me because it was in-state. I got in-state tuition, didn't have to pay as much to go there. And also they had a wildlife program, but I would have liked to go to Colorado State University or any of the other well-known wildlife schools. Just didn't have the funding or just didn't have the know-how to apply for schools like that. And so funding has been a big challenge. Don't come from a wealthy family, don't come from a wealthy tribe. And so, there's always misperception about that as well. And then as an undergrad and even as a graduate student, it's often difficult to find a community of Native students, other Native staff who share those same perspectives of, that tribal background or growing up on a reservation or being a person of color. And then also finding mentors like I had explained earlier, where I didn't have many mentors who've been through academia, who went through the academic system and are, have a position that they're very passionate about and able to incorporate their perspectives. And so I've always had that difficulty in finding mentors at all levels of my career so far. But they are there, and they're few and far in between, but once you find them, they're very helpful. And then also balancing academia. And what I mean by balancing academia is that Native students often sacrifice time for cultural growth, for example, in learning their language, tradition, and culture. And so what the factors for success were for me were my family. So my immediate family, my partner, my kids, my mom and dad, and then extended family, so uncles and cousins, and then my community. Always hearing, words of motivation from tribal members and especially tribal leaders go a long way when you're a student and you're far from home. And then the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Program, which was at Purdue University and here at which provided a community and then also funding for school, just costs of attending school, but also provided that family feeling and being able to network with other Native students who are also far from home, or a diversity of Native students who maybe don't have that growing up on the reservation experience, or maybe they grew up in an urban environment. But it's all, all those experiences and perspectives play an important role in building that community. And then also the Native Peoples Wildlife Management Working Group of the Wildlife Society, which was very important for me as a master's student, as a graduate student, and even now in building that network and family type community of other Native students who are going to school for the same thing. I think a lot of us share that motivation to return home and to give back to our communities. And with that, I'd just like to thank you and allow me for being here in this space and sharing my perspectives with you all. I think it's important for folks like us to do that, especially for other students and those who are thinking about academia. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you, Daniel. I really want to say thank you all for being here. I think that it's really great that there are so many people that really want to be part of this discussion and this conversation and that want to listen to our stories. I also want to say thanks so much to Lisa and Brennan for inviting me to be part of this panel, and to the other panelists for so bravely sharing their stories. As they know, this is actually quite uncomfortable to be up here to share these types of stories with you. So as Lisa said, my name is Alicia and I'm a postdoc at the University of Montana, and I am now transitioning over to a faculty position at Michigan State University. And so I want to start with just a little bit of background about me. I grew up in Mumbai, India, and when I was about 16 years old, this was in the year 2000, my family and I immigrated to the US, to Austin, Texas. And science was always an interest for me, even as a child in India, and especially biology and especially conservation. But it really wasn't until I got to UT Austin for my undergrad that I really sort of learned that I could turn this passion into a profession. So I have to say that my academic journey sort of began at UT as an undergrad. And, you know, since then, I've really had mostly positive experiences in academia throughout that time. And I feel like I'll preface sort of everything I'm about to say with this, that I have enjoyed being an academic. I've had mentors and advisors, almost all who have identified as white men. They've been some of my strongest advocates, my most ardent supporters. So I realize how lucky I have been, and I'm very grateful for that. But still, there has always been this sort of, the best way I can say it is sort of an underlying sense of discomfort. And as I've grown older, I've realized that that discomfort is really a background awareness that I don't belong where I am in academia. I'm culturally different, I look different, I sound different, I think differently. And so I'm able to sort of deal with it. I feel that right now, it's always with me. I'm able to deal with it because you kind of have to if you want to move forward. But there have been incidents along the way that sort of have brought that awareness of and that discomfort to the forefront. And I'll share some of those experiences with you. So one happened about 12 years ago. This was a few years after I had graduated from my undergrad. I was hired as a summer field technician at the US Forest Service in Montana, actually, in sort of a rural town. And I was really excited about this job. This is one of my first field experiences. And I recall asking the supervisor for housing accommodation and wondering where I was going to live. And the supervisor said, oh, we don't do that for our technicians. Our techs just drive up in their trucks and they live out of their trucks for the 3 months that they're here, or they camp in this beautiful wilderness that we have. So you can do those things. And I was really stunned. I come from a culture, we don't camp in India. In a lot of developing countries, camping is not a thing. It's sort of a Western concept. But more than that, and I think everybody on this panel has actually said something similar to this, I was acutely aware of what I looked like and what I sounded like. And being in rural Montana, I was terrified of being by myself and someone looking at me and not being very kind, because I am obviously an immigrant. And so what I ended up doing is I found an apartment that I could rent, or a basement apartment that I could rent for the 3 months that I was there. And you might think that that was a good solution to the problem, except that the man living upstairs, when he found out that I was an Indian immigrant, accosted me aggressively several times, trying to preach Christianity to me and telling me that, you know, the sort of pagan religion that I must follow in India is rubbish, and, you know, I should consider converting. And this was extremely stressful, and I didn't enjoy the experience as much as my white male technician friends who were also hired on that project. So I guess this is really just a story of inclusion or not being included, because there was this underlying expectation that everybody had had the same experiences and that everyone should feel comfortable in the same situations, which was absolutely not the case for me. But I have to say, I've since worked with agencies, the USGS, for example, on the glacial meltwater stonefly project at Glacier National Park with CESU funding. And I've had a wonderful experience, but the difference is I've been the leader of those projects, and I get to call the shots about my safety and that of my field technicians. So my change in experience has really had to do with where, what leadership role I have, or what role I have in the research at all. In more formal academic settings, I've experienced sort of the boilerplate garden variety of discrimination. And that type of discrimination sort of rears its ugly head usually when people that look like me have any kind of success. And one incident that stands out pretty heavily in my memory is when I received the graduate research fellowship from the National Science Foundation. This, for those of you that don't know about it, this is a really coveted award by early graduate students. It's difficult to get. And those that get it, I mean, it's prestigious to have. And I recall really celebrating and then quickly being told by a much older professor that, oh, of course you got it because they give it to people like you. And what he was implying was that merit had nothing to do with it for me. I got it because I identify as a South Asian woman. And the worst part about that is that I believed him. And it wasn't until a few years later that I was in a Women in Science seminar when I learned that the National Science Foundation doesn't view Asians, nor does it view women as underrepresented minorities. So sitting in the audience there, I suddenly realized that he had duped me into thinking that I didn't deserve an award. And you know, the damage was done immediately when he said that to me, but the undoing of that damage, the unlearning, the unfeeling of everything that I'd felt so far took a very long time. And I still feel, even though I'm transitioning over to a faculty position, I still struggle with that and with several incidents like that. So I think one of the most difficult parts for me, which again, I'm hearing Daniel, Selena, and I have all said this, is that I didn't have anyone I could talk to about these incidents. I didn't have anyone that looked like me, that had experienced academia like me to talk to, who would sort of intrinsically understand what I was going through. So I think now that I'm sort of transitioning over to this faculty position at Michigan State, I get to be that person that I didn't have. And I'm really proud that I'm able to do that for other students. And I'll sort of just end with this and say that I think one way forward for all of us is for people like us on this panel to find our way to a seat at the table somehow, so that we can make the change the changes that we want to see from within, that we can be part of that solution and have our voices heard from within. And so with that, I'll say thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
All right, Alicia, Danielle, Selena, Anaya, before we get to the question and answer portion, I just want to say thank you again for opening yourselves up to us, because as some of you pointed out, you know, in asking you to be on this panel, I've asked you to put yourself in a very vulnerable place. And I appreciate your willingness and courage to tell your stories. So again, for the audience, if you have questions for Alicia, Selena, Danielle, and Anaya, please use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. And in the time that we have, we'll get through as many as we can. So as people are coming up with their questions and entering, I will make sure there's not one in the chat box. Please use the question and answer box. So a question for you. Having a mentor and having someone you can go to seems to be a theme that's important, right? It's important for any student beginning college and their college journey. And as we're hearing, especially important for BIPOC students. But you might, you don't necessarily have people in faculty positions that look like you. Alicia, you get to be that person, as you said, as you accept this faculty position. So I guess what would, I would like to be a part of that group that provides that for you. I'm a white woman, Brendan's a white male. How can we provide that support that you need?
There are a couple of opportunities that I know of. I believe the Society for American Indians and Chicanos in Science, SACNIS, they have a mentoring program. And SACNIS isn't one of those like elitist professional societies where you have to be American Indian or Chicano to be in it. Again, there are ways to probably interact with BIPOC people through other professional societies. I know that the Ecological Society of America has a TEK working group. And so, quite often students are looking to those kind of working groups to get some professional experience. And, whenever you go to conferences, networking with the students that are wallflowers and the meet and greets after all the speaking is done, just because it's easier to interact with people who come up to you than it is to take the initiative and go just walk into a group of professionals. Also, the American Indian College Fund has some resources for mentoring opportunities for people that I know of, and I'm sure that's just scratching the surface.
So here's kind of a similar question. Any suggestions on, and I know not all of you may necessarily have worked with federal agencies, but how can federal agencies create a more inclusive environment for BIPOC students based on your experience?
I can start with just a little bit. I think the big thing that I've experienced, especially when I was just a technician, didn't have really any say in anything except being told what I needed to do, is just finding a way to know that those people, BIPOC people that want to be part of these experiences may not have all the knowledge and the security and the confidence to do things that a lot of the typically white technicians have. If there's, and you know, having that expectation that, oh, you should feel comfortable doing this because everyone else is doing it, is really unfair, because that's just completely negating what that person might have gone through in their lives, or what they might have experienced, or their awareness of themselves as being different. I just think that there just needs to be more and more of that awareness that people are different, people think differently, come from different places, and there should be never any expectation that everyone is happy doing something, that there needs to be a bit more kindness that's sort of given. So yeah, that's what I would say.
So here's a question from Jen Harrington, who runs the Native American Natural Resource Program here at UM. And she asks, how do institutions of higher education and agencies address justice for BIPOC populations? And that might be a question you don't necessarily know, but I'm gonna maybe dial it in a little bit. And I'm wondering, Anaya, if you might share your experience of working with MSU on the BIPOC strategic plan.
So yeah, from my experience, MSU specifically, just because I can't talk for other universities because I don't attend other universities, but MSU's responses seem to be very performative in the way that MSU doesn't have a response unless everybody else in the country has a response. So there have been issues with MSU doing this in the past. So MSU released a statement about what happened to George Floyd because everybody else had released a statement about what happened to George Floyd. But I'm also involved in other marginalized group clubs. Like I'm an active member of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Club and also the AAIP Club for Asian Pacific Islander students. And each of those groups independently reached out to the university and said, hey, there's this incident going on and would you release a statement about it? And MSU just flat out said no. So the institution, I've learned, has a lot of rules that they have to abide by when wording these things, because I've had to reword the action plan for BIPOC students 5 times now due to like MSU's HR standards about what they can and cannot say for legal reasons. So due to these legal reasons, the university doesn't ever actually address justice. And when these things need to be addressed, it falls upon the students like me to create stuff like the action plan in order to have these things that we want fixed.
So here's a question from an agency person. Do you have suggestions on how to cultivate a diverse applicant pool? He's specifically asking for wildlife positions from technician to postdoc level, but I would say how do we increase the diversity of an applicant pool for a management agency position?
I think one thing that could be done is reach out and invite people to apply. I've been on several, especially with faculty jobs, there are ways to find us through lab websites and, those kinds of things. Sometimes it takes more of an effort to just reach those people. And you guys should definitely correct me on this too. But people have reached out and said, we know that you are, we're trying to increase the diversity of our faculty in this particular place. Would you be interested in applying for this position that we're opening? I greatly appreciate that. And I did apply for those positions. So that's sort of one way in which you could sort of specifically reach out to people or labs or groups of people that you're trying to target.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. For a student, I think reaching out and finding those students like us takes a lot more effort, and reaching out to folks like Jennifer or folks who work with Native students or other students of color. I think it's more effort on their end because for us, we're applying to everything and anything, and oftentimes we never get a call back for an interview. Especially, I've experienced that after completing my master's at Purdue University, moving back to New Mexico, close to home. I've applied for tribal, state, federal positions and often never get a call back or never even get an email. And folks like us would like to work for those agencies, but it's just, I don't know, difficult and discouraging sometimes. Tribes often call back and say, give an interview, which is great as well, because like I explained earlier, there's less tribal folks working for tribes even. And so that's kind of nice. But for folks who want to work for an agency or create that diversity, it's difficult.
I can speak to this. I was recently accepted into the Directorate Fellows position program, and that's a direct hire position for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I was put onto it by an email that I received from our Tribal Natural Resource Program Director, Jen Harrington. But quite honestly, I'm not sure that any of my other peers, whether or not it fits into their summer is a different thing. But then, like, just knowing more about those programs is really hard to do just through an email. Even if you mean well by emailing it to the natural resource tribal program person at a college, putting forth an effort to, set up a Zoom and meet with those students, reaching out to those students directly can make a difference for BIPOC students, like feeling that they're wanted. And that's also a big part of inclusion is, the feeling that an institution creates for people like us. And, you'll learn just as much from the students that you hire on, whether or not it's a competitive applicant pool or not. A lot of students just put those emails in a junk folder. And so the effort, is well meant, but it falls short more often than not.
Most of the questions that I am reading, and I am mindful of times, so we'll wrap up shortly, but most of the questions are how can I, increase representation of BIPOC students? And in some ways, I feel a little silly asking you. I mean, you're the students. It's not up to, you shouldn't be telling us how to get to you. I mean, you should be part of the conversation, but it definitely has to be us and higher institutions and the agencies making the effort to figure it out, whether that is reaching out to specific colleges, departments at universities. But at least we should, you know, keep the conversation going and keep listening to your stories, because I hope one day we might have a session like this again, and you're not having those experiences. I don't want you to have those experiences. I think most everyone that logged on to this panel logged on because they don't want you to have those experiences. So we are at the hour. I am going to wrap up. Thank you again for opening yourselves up to sharing with us. I know I appreciate it, and I know our audience today has appreciated it too. So this wraps up our 2021 Rocky Mountain CESU seminar series. So I want to thank all of you who participated today, and thank everyone who has put this together. Bethany Allen, who is hiding behind the Frankie College of Forestry and Conservation screen, has really put a big effort in making these seminars happen. So thank you, Bethany. Thank you to our audience, and thank you, our panel members today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you, everyone.